thanks so much. I'm very happy to present this project here. The title is a bit stolen from a recent book, which is called How to Design Good Service, How to Design It. And I just thought this is something one can transpose also to democratic studies. So what is the, oh, it doesn't, oh.
So it's just like,
okay.
Okay. Just use.
Yeah, excellent. So what is the basic problems? I think we are confronting increasing disenchantment with current democracy. And so there's a lot of ideas about constitutional redesigning. There are also a lot of efforts going on in the world. I just mentioned too the Chile Constitutional Convention or the Conference on the Future of Europe. And they all are based on an inclusive and open vision of democratic designing. Hans Assenbaum has called that doing democratic design democratically. Well, we'll see a bit. Maybe it's not as democratic as you might imagine, but it's still an effort to say we cannot delegate constitution making just to the sort of old wise men who know how to design a constitution. It has to involve citizens as well.
So it's just this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's also interesting research by Eisenstadt and co-authors who have shown empirically a couple of years ago that if you have a more participatory orientation towards constitutional redesign, then liberal democracy is more viable and stable. It's never perfect, but it's still kind of a good empirical information that this really matters in real life. Nonetheless, several of these ongoing events have kind of failed. I mean, we all know the referendum on the Chilean constitutional process was a failure. We also, for instance, have cases like the one at the European Union, where I really doubt whether it will ever have any sort of political bite. Probably it's just an event that happens. They rewrite a nice report, and that's about it. Nonetheless, I think we should and can do better, but I think we need to do it differently and maybe also with a more modest ambition. I will come back to that towards the end. So how should we do designing? Michael Saward has written a fabulous book, I think a masterpiece, saying, well, we have to rethink democratic designing from scratch. And the basic message that Michael says is we should not just start with specific designs. And that's what most people are doing. Do you want more direct democracy? Do you want more mini publics? But that's the wrong question. The proper question is first to identify problems as well as imaginations of democracy, and then work through, when you have identified specific problems, what kinds of designs really match these problems. And then this is the basic message from Michael Saward. We might find out that depending on problem, there might be multiple solutions to address that, not just one. If we just stick with one specific design, we'll find out, well, it has pros and cons, but maybe we see there's a much bigger variety of things we can do for democratic designing. For instance, problems here, I've just listed some that came across what citizens have with current democracy: distance between voters and politicians, or capture by special interests, or, for instance, also an overload of disrespectful and polarizing communication in the public sphere, or what many have also said, a lack of economic and political equality. These are all problems, and the question is, what sort of designs do match that? Now, what we're going to do, and I have already to say a hearty thanks to those who have already helped us with this first survey that we will field in just the upcoming March, to see a bit what are the imaginations and problems that citizens see when they think about democracy. And it was a sort of a kind of an idea to say, we can ask citizens what comes to mind if you think about democracy, the sort of imagination. And here's a wonderful example from Second World War. And of course, citizens won't do it in such an extensive and lovely way like this journalist who was asked by the war board during World War II, what is democracy? And he has a fabulous answer. He says, it's the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. And maybe that's a bit old-fashioned, but he says it's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the rationed coffee. Democracy is a request from a warboard in the middle of the morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. And of course, as I'm saying, I mean, we might not get such sophisticated answers, but it shows that citizens might have imaginations. And Rod Decombe has an upcoming book where he says we all know a bit what democracy is, and we should articulate this. So this is a first step that we're doing. Now the slide has already switched. The question is now, how do these imaginations and problems people have match onto democratic designs? And this is the first time we're presenting this to an audience. This is still in the making. We came up with some sort of basic things, how democracies could be organized, and then we have a number of additions. The idea is we can organize democracy in three ways. We can have it, and this is also referring to Abraham Lincoln's wonderful saying, we can have it in a direct way, government of the people. We can have it in an electoral way, government by the people, and in a delegative way, government for the people. Now, if we, as I'm saying, this is not yet fully finalized. We also tried a bit to say how much complexity can ordinary citizens handle. I will say much more on how we're going to implement this later on. But if you look at direct democracy, we thought there are two basic ways. You can have direct democratic instruments, and you can also have deliberative mini-publics. Now, we have consulted GPT chat and said, how should democracy look like on Mars? And it came up with something that we missed here, liquid democracy. So that's not in, but we thought maybe this is far too complicated for citizens to understand all that, pros and cons of liquid democracy. Sorry, it just moves a bit too quickly.
I don't know what this is.
Yeah. Same for the electoral model. We would like to distinguish between a majoritarian and a more consensus model. For instance, if you think that political talk is really corrupted and politicians are very unfriendly, it is true that research shows the consensus model has major implications for how political talk is going on. So it might be friendlier and nicer than in majoritarian systems. What we're leaving out here is, for instance, a sort of a checks and balance model. John Gehring and co-authors have distinguished between decentralized models like the United States and the Nordic models, what they call centripetal governance. But again, we think maybe it's just too much to present that all to citizens. On the right-hand side, we also want to bring in a bit more authoritarian ways of designing. For instance, this executive leader model, which is an interesting one. I would say it's a kind of an authoritarian way of doing democracy. You delegate it to some sort of wise leader. But there has been an interesting literature saying this is the sort of plebiscitary leader democracy, saying, well, at least for populists, that might also close the responsiveness gap, because such a leader might better feel what ordinary citizens want. I mean, you might not buy into that discourse, but it's at least for some people that might make sense. Now, what is also clear is these are basic institutional designs, but there's much more going on. For instance, radical Democrats would say, well, we need to repoliticize the public sphere, the political sphere. And the question is, how do they do that? We had a long reading into this literature, and there has been a recent special issue saying, well, radical Democrats are not particularly good at saying what sort of institutional designs really matter. Well, you can say maybe the deliberative mini-public should be added with a council democracy model. That's also what a lot of protest movements are doing, a sort of bottom-up, in some way, not in a way, a bottom-up democratic space, participatory space, where we exchange arguments. Has existed in real practice, but we would still say maybe it's more about saying how should the public sphere, that would also relate to the second one, should be organized. Should we have a more kind of calm public sphere that you say you're just part of associations and parties, or do you want to have that radical vision where you, for instance, glue yourself to the street? How should that look like? And you could well imagine citizens, including myself, I'm very much for a sort of an electoral model with additions, but I would say we need a rough and loud public sphere. That's what really constrains elites in a good way. So you can have these combinations. Or for instance, if you care about social democracy, I think none of these designs really help us to get there. I mean, you can say direct democracy, but direct democracy is very often very exclusive to specific, especially underrepresented groups. So it just, in a way, reifies what we already have, a sort of a kind of a privileged majority. So maybe we just need other ways to satisfy such demands. So the idea is to present people with such designs, then saying, how should other things be organized, like the public sphere? And this is where we're just working on, is a sort of a new way of measuring this. So people will have something like a puzzle they can compose, like a menu in a restaurant, where you can say, I want an electoral model, consensus one, but I want to combine that with massive protests and, for instance, a lot of social democracy. You can do something like this. And that's the sort of kind of challenge we're facing, that citizens really understand what it's all about and set it together. A last point on this. Some may have missed interesting intersections between the two models. I'm only highlighting this. For instance, you could say, I'm very much into the electoral system, but I want to enhance responsiveness. And for instance, you could say something like what Mike Neblo has proposed, a directly representative democracy, you can say, or what Jenny Mansbridge calls recursive representation, that you have more communicative links between the elected and the citizens. And you could say, this is exactly what I want as well. So you could in some way reshape your mix of what you want. Now, back to more standard things of designing. Michael Savoort makes a strong argument and says we can only do designing on Earth in our path-dependent systems. And he also has a sort of a top-down example. What is the problem of the UK? This is lack of political equality. And then he comes up with some suggestions how to remedy this, make the system more proportional, add more citizen assemblies to it. Fine. But we had this discussion yesterday. Maybe people are very conservative when they think what they can do. I give an example in Germany. For instance, if you want more direct democracy at the national level, that is not possible. The Constitutional Court has ruled that out. You can want it, but it's not something that you can realize. So you might end up and say, okay, the available menu, like in a restaurant, is restricted. I want maybe a pizza, but they don't have it, so I'm stick what they have. So we thought we also need a sort of a utopian setting, and that's what we call designing on Mars, where people are also put behind a veil of ignorance, saying you don't know whether you're in the political minority or majority, and so on. And the idea is then that we might really create or get much more authentic preferences, but also maybe more radical preferences, because you can say, this is what I really want without any sort of constraints. Now, we have added some variations to this. Franziska Meyer is yeah, it's over. So she's interested in cosmopolitan visions. And of course, the Mars-Earth thing doesn't really fit, because you could say, on Mars, dealing with cosmopolitan issues, I mean, that's a stupid hypothetical setting. Do we then need to create new, in a way, how do we deal with potential aliens coming? And that's all crazy. Yeah. So we said in some way, maybe we have already something which might be more interesting to study. And that's what she will do, a sort of a world versus European Union setting, because you can say world politics, how we organize those. That's a very utopian question. John and I, we once worked on, for instance, should it be a world parliament, or should it be a sort of a more mini-public solutions to world problems? And what Franziska will do, she will look at French and German citizens and say, how would you design the European Union, which is existing, or remedy the European Union? And how would you do it in the world stage? And we might have a piggyback project by Elena Schuck, who we hope that it gets funded. And she said, maybe there are also feminist visions of how democracy should be designed. And that's exactly her idea, to say, well, maybe we could look at Venus versus Earth. Venus, where in some way women are equal, and how would we design it? How would men react if you would really live in a very different Venus environment? So the whole idea is, the whole kind of idea can be enlarged. Now, I want to move fast. I mean, there are different ways of doing democratic designing, and I think it's also based on a serious number problem. And I think it's at the moment also complicated by the fact that many citizens are not willing to participate in large-scale kind of deliberative exercises. So if you really want to have a representative sample, say of 1,500 or 2,000 people, even a deliberative poll cannot handle this. And the idea is then maybe we need a sort of a more moderate design, a kind of an engagement design. I'll say something on this in 2 seconds, but we are still interested in sort of a co-creative deliberative design. This is, for instance, what design futuring scholars have proposed. And this is all what we say we need kind of both. We want to see what happens when people, large representative people in some way think about things, and what happens if smaller numbers really deliberate on these things. And Franziska and I, we found in an experiment, it's hopefully forthcoming with the European Journal of Political Research, where we can show a little engagement. Engagement with arguments, pro and con, can really stimulate massive reflection. You don't need a full-fledged setup to exactly get people to think through models. So what we could show is they have a much higher argument repertoire after they were forced to engage with specific arguments. So let me. So this is how it works. We will do that in 3 countries, India, Germany, and the United States. India will be last because that's also the most demanding setting. A survey company will recruit people, and then they are randomly assigned to 3 conditions. That's the engagement design. So they're either in the Earth condition, in the Mars condition, or in a control conditions. And in the Mars and Earth conditions, they will get a wonderful information video on these designs, not in the sort of table version that I have presented, that's just for academic purposes, but in a kind of a lively way that you have like a good video. What is possible? How could you design it? Including then also some arguments pro and con the various designs. For instance, what does direct democracy say on equality and stuff like that. And then they will have to then set their own kind of visions how they would design it, either on Mars and Earth. And the control group just gets the kind of basic informations, but not the arguments. And then they will also write a couple of essays, how future democracy should be designed, and we'll have a follow-up questionnaire. That's the sort of engagement setting where we're still discussing how we really design that with this engagement with arguments. The really co-creative setting is exactly the same, but it's much more complex. And it will also involve much fewer citizens. So we'll also add an expert dimension to it, and it starts with imaginations. Experts are listening and then reacting to these imaginations and problems that people formulate. They also get the sort of information package, but it's a real kind of interaction, a co-creative interaction online on how to design democracy. And we think we might get much more creative visions of what one could do. And it would also then end up more with recommendations, including also essays and a follow-up questionnaire. But the idea is really to have 2 versions and see a bit how does a kind of a really large group of representative citizens, what would they want? And maybe those who are more engaged see a bit what they want from democracy. What do we expect? Well, we expect that and I will show you in a second a bit how that could look like in practice, that on the one hand, we might get really people wanting blended forms of democracy, exactly what Michael Saward would expect that comes out. And maybe in the co-creative design, also kind of meta-consensual sortings of what to do. For instance, you could say, we all agree that politics in some way needs more contestation, more input from citizens who are unhappy with the state of affairs. And then you can say, but how do we organize this? I mean, that could be, for instance, done via direct democracy, but it could also be done with a sort of a more active public sphere where you say you have a lot of kind of repoliticization and constraining elite actors to do things. So that's a bit the idea that we might also find in this co-creative setting, maybe also some kind of meta consensus on where to go. We also think that it's very much dependent on the treatment. As I said before, more radical visions in the Mars, Venus, or world treatment compared to the more Earth settings. But it also maybe really depend on prior dispositions. Saskia Goldberg and I, for instance, found, and we'll show that in 2 seconds, that different kind of social strata have very different visions of how democracy should look like. This is already coming here. This is from a different study that we have just conducted together with Mark Warren, Jamie Druckmann, and the leading researcher is here, Eva Maria Trüdinger from the University of Stuttgart. This was a conjoined experiment. This is a kind of a pre-study to the whole thing. And what you see here is we had this discussion already yesterday. These are representative American citizens, and they were presented with different ways of how to organize democracy, and they're damn conservative. So the reference point here that's at the top is a parliament with elected representatives. What you see here when it's on the left-hand side, people or citizens don't like that so much. What they particularly don't like is a single leader, this executive model. But mini publics also don't fare particularly well. So people don't want empowered mini publics. But what they want is what you see here at the on the other thing here is they want additions. For instance, they want to have the possibility that a final referendum happens. Or if it's a single leader, that in a way the whole thing is checked by parliament. What also matters, you might see it here on orientation and outcome favorability. People also care what's coming out substantively. And we always think about designs. But here it's if these main institutions don't share the basic political views, people don't go for it. Of course, that's obvious, but the effect is really, I need to go back, the effect is really, really strong. Same for outcome favorability. If a body decides against your kind of political preferences, you're not happy. So this is something we need to factor in when we think about designing democracy. A final thing, and that's maybe just an interesting thing, we also looked at populists in Germany. And here the preferences are really different. That's the sort of heterogeneity. You see the baseline here, these are the red ones with the circle around. Compared to the legislator, they really favor an empowered mini public. And they're also much more open to a single leader. They still don't like it, but compared to the others, they're far more open to having a single leader. So we have preference heterogeneity. So this is my final point. What is the whole thing? My whole thing is a kind of a modest attempt to have more robust anticipations of what citizens want from democracy. And that's why I also think we really need proper representative samples, large samples, to see what also different types of populists want from democracy. By the way, we also want creativity, and that's, I think, we can really solve with this more co-creative design. We also want to develop novel ways of measuring these preferences, because that's a big frontier so far. Blended forms of democracy, these combinations, are badly captured by existing designs. People then still ask, do you want direct democracy? Do you want technocracy? But it's maybe really at these intersections where it gets really interesting. And we're also very interested what underrepresented and disenchanted citizens want and how we can reconnect them with democracy. So it's all ongoing, and I hope that maybe the next time I'm here, we really have some results, what's coming out of this first engagement survey. Thank you so much.